The perpetual hum of Deep Space Research Station Helios's environmental systems provided a steady backbeat to Nix's careful observations. Her iridescent scales shifted colors slightly as she adjusted her position in the observation deck, her eyes blinking in sequence as she reviewed her notes on her latest research subject, human sleep patterns. Fascinating and deeply inefficient, she muttered, her translator converting her native clicking sounds into standard human English. The subject of her current study, Marcus Reed, was performing maintenance on the station's primary communication array, his movements precise despite having just emerged from what humans called a good night's sleep. Nix had arrived at Helios 3 standard weeks ago as part of the Galactic Science Exchange Program, officially to study human engineering practices. However, she had become increasingly distracted by what she considered a bizarre biological quirk. Humans required approximately 8 hours of complete inactivity every day cycle. Engineering specialist Reed, she called out, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. May I inquire about your recent period of unconsciousness? Marcus looked up from his work, adjusting his safety harness as he turned to face the Centaurian xenobiologist. His dark skin glistened slightly under the station's lights, and his close-cropped hair showed traces of gray at the temples. You mean my sleep? Sure, what do you want to know? I've observed that you spend approximately 33.3% of each day cycle in this dormant state. How does your species compensate for such a significant loss of productive time? Marcus chuckled, a sound that still fascinated Nix with its complexity. It's not lost time, Dr. Nix. Sleep is essential for our health, memory consolidation, and mental well-being. But surely your civilization would advance more rapidly if you remained continuously active, like my species. Nix's scales rippled with genuine confusion, creating a cascade of purple and blue hues across her serpentine form. That's not how human biology works, Marcus explained, securing his tools before floating closer to the observation deck's viewport. Our brains need time to process information, repair cellular damage, and prepare for the next day's challenges. Without sleep, we'd actually become less efficient, not more. Nix's upper eyes narrowed while her lower pair widened, an expression of skepticism in her species. And this dreaming phenomenon? Your consciousness creates fictional scenarios while inactive. What possible evolutionary advantage could that serve? Dreams can help us solve problems, process emotions, even inspire creativity, Marcus replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Sometimes I've gone to bed stuck on an engineering problem and woken up with the solution. Preposterous, Nix declared, though her scales shifted to an interested shade of amber. Yet your species achieved faster-than-light travel despite this daily shutdown. Most intriguing. As she spoke, the station's lights flickered briefly, an occurrence that had become more frequent over the past few days. Marcus frowned, pulling up a diagnostic panel on his wrist computer. Speaking of problems needing solutions, these power fluctuations are getting worse. The source has been eluding our engineering team for days. Perhaps you should engage in this sleep activity to find the answer, Nix suggested, her tone caught between sarcasm and genuine scientific curiosity. Maybe I will, Marcus replied with a grin. But first, would you like to help me check the secondary power couplings? You might find our inefficient human engineering methods interesting. Nix's scales rippled with excitement at the opportunity for hands-on research. Acceptable. Though I still maintain that your species' need for regular unconsciousness is a significant design flaw. As they made their way through the station's corridors, neither of them could have predicted how this peculiar cultural difference would soon become crucial to the station's survival, or how it would change their understanding of each other's species forever. Subject appears to be entering the unconscious state, Nix whispered into her research recorder, her scales dimmed to minimal luminescence as she observed through the transparent partition of Marcus's quarters. Respiratory rate decreasing, muscular activity minimal. She adjusted her monitoring equipment, fascinated by the readings. The past week had seen her unofficial study of human sleep patterns grow increasingly detailed. After their conversation about the power fluctuations, Marcus had somewhat jokingly agreed to let her monitor his sleep cycle for her research. What had started as scientific curiosity was becoming an obsession. Temporal lobe activity increasing, she noted, watching the neural scanners display. Beginning of what humans call dream state. Most peculiar. Dr. Nix, a voice called softly from behind her. She turned to find Dr. Jasmine Park, the station's chief medical officer, watching her with an amused expression. You know, on Earth, watching someone sleep without their knowledge is generally considered creepy. Nix's scales flushed a defensive orange. Engineering specialist Reed gave permission for this study. I am merely collecting data on this fascinating biological phenomenon. Jasmine leaned against the corridor wall, her dark eyes twinkling. And your sudden interest has nothing to do with the fact that you've been spending every waking hour with him for the past week? The power fluctuations require our combined expertise, Nix replied primly, though her scales rippled with an embarrassed purple hue. The correlation between human sleep patterns and problem-solving efficiency is merely a secondary research interest. Of course, Jasmine said with a knowing smile. Though you might be interested to know that humans often dream about things, or people, that occupy their thoughts during waking hours. Before Nix could respond, a movement from Marcus's quarters caught their attention. He was muttering in his sleep, something that had fascinated Nix since she first observed it. No, the quantum harmonizer, reversed the polarity. Marcus mumbled, turning over. Nix's upper eyes widened. Is he solving engineering problems while unconscious? Your species continues to surprise me, Dr. Park. Jasmine stifled a laugh. Sleep talking doesn't usually make much sense. Though. She paused, thinking. Sometimes our subconscious minds can make connections our waking minds miss. I've had patients who've described symptoms in their sleep that helped me diagnose them. Remarkable, Nix murmured, recording this new information. Though highly inefficient compared to my species' continuous consciousness. Different isn't always inefficient, Jasmine pointed out. Your species evolved in a different environment, with different needs. The diversity of life is what makes the universe interesting. Their conversation was interrupted by another power fluctuation, more severe than previous ones. The corridor lights dimmed significantly before returning to normal. These incidents are becoming more frequent, Nix observed, her scales shifting to a concerned green. Yet despite our combined efforts, we haven't identified the cause. Maybe you need to sleep on it, Jasmine suggested with a wink. That would be impossible. My species doesn't. Nix stopped as she noticed Jasmine's expression. Ah. Human humor. You are suggesting that unconsciousness might help solve the problem, as Marcus claimed. You never know. Sometimes we need to power down to power through. As if in response to her words, Marcus stirred again. The resonance cascade, it's in the secondary. He muttered before falling silent. Nix's scales suddenly flashed bright yellow, her species equivalent of a eureka moment. The secondary systems. Of course. The power fluctuations aren't originating in the primary systems at all. That's why we couldn't trace them. She quickly began gathering her monitoring equipment. I must check something immediately. Thank you, Dr. Park. This conversation has been most illuminating. As Nix hurried away, Jasmine watched her go with an amused expression. Sleep on it indeed, she murmured to herself, making a mental note to update her own research on interspecies relationships aboard space stations. The station's night cycle was in full effect and the first major power surge hit. Nix was in the engineering bay, following up on her theory about the secondary systems, when every light on Helios simultaneously flared to painful brightness before plunging into darkness. Emergency power activated, the station's AI announced calmly as dim red lighting flickered to life. Warning, cascade failure detected in primary and secondary power grids. Nix's scales pulsed with alarmed patterns of red and white as she accessed the nearest diagnostic terminal. The readings confirmed her worst fears. The power fluctuations had been early warnings of a much more serious problem. "Computer, locate engineering specialist Reed," she commanded, her translator struggling to keep up with her agitated clicking. "Engineering specialist Reed is in his quarters, sleep cycle in progress." Nix hesitated for a fraction of a second. Her research had emphasized how crucial uninterrupted sleep was for human cognitive function. However, the rapidly deteriorating power readings on her screen suggested they didn't have the luxury of waiting. "Emergency override, quarters of engineering specialist Reed," she ordered, already moving through the corridors with practiced ease. The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing Marcus tangled in his sleeping bag, secured to the wall in the zero-gravity environment. "Marcus," she called out, then louder, "Marcus." He jolted awake, instinctively grabbing his restraints. "Nix. What's?" His eyes quickly registered the emergency lighting. "How bad?" "Cascade failure in both power grids. My analysis suggests we have approximately 47 minutes before complete system failure." Marcus was already moving, pulling on his work uniform with practiced efficiency despite his obvious grogginess. "Theory. The secondary systems were masking a degradation in the primary grid. When I attempted to isolate the secondary systems for testing, it triggered the cascade." Her scales shifted to a guilty blue. "I should have waited for your assistance." "No time for that now," Marcus said, securing his tool belt. "We need to reach the main reactor control room. Can you access the preliminary readings?" They moved through the station's corridors quickly, Nix sharing data as they went. What struck her was how rapidly Marcus's mind seemed to engage despite being abruptly woken. His questions were precise, his reasoning clear, even though by her calculations his sleep cycle had been interrupted during its deepest phase. The reactor control room was chaos. Dr. Park was there, helping to coordinate the emergency response team, her medical expertise needed in case of radiation exposure. The room's displays showed a critical situation getting worse by the second. "The containment field is failing," one of the engineers reported. "We can't shut down the reactor without risking a breach." Marcus studied the readings, his face illuminated by the red emergency lights and the glow of warning displays. Then he did something that amazed Nix, he closed his eyes. "What are you doing?" she asked, scales flickering with confusion. "Remember what I said about solving problems in dreams?" He opened his eyes. "I saw something like this, in a dream last night. The resonance cascade I was mumbling about, it wasn't nonsense." He turned to the main control panel. "We need to deliberately desynchronize the containment field." "That's contrary to all standard procedures," Nix protested, though she was already running the calculations. "Exactly. The cascade is being caused by a harmonic resonance between the primary and secondary fields. If we desynchronize them..." He was already typing commands. "They'll dampen each other instead of amplifying," Nix finished, her scales brightening with understanding. "But the timing would have to be precise to within microseconds." Marcus grinned tiredly. "Good thing we have a Centaurian's processing speed and a human's intuitive problem-solving, isn't it?" What followed was an intricate dance of human intuition and alien precision. Marcus called out timing adjustments based on what he called gut feeling, while Nix's superior computational abilities translated them into exact commands. Dr. Park watched with barely concealed fascination as the unlikely pair worked in perfect sync. Gradually, the warning signals began to quiet. The reactor's angry red glow subsided to its normal blue shimmer. Around the control room, tension melted into exhausted relief. "Power system stabilizing," the station's AI confirmed. "Containment field integrity at 97% and rising." Nix turned to Marcus, her scales now pulsing with a complex mixture of colors that reflected her conflicting emotions. "Your solution was completely illogical, and perfect. How did your unconscious mind make that connection?" Marcus yawned, the adrenaline clearly wearing off. Sometimes you need to let your mind wander to find the right path. Speaking of which. He checked his wrist computer. I still have 4 hours left in my sleep cycle, and I intend to use them. As he turned to leave, he paused. You know, Nix, instead of just studying human sleep, maybe you should try to understand why we value it. There's more to efficiency than constant activity. Nix watched him go, her scales settling into a thoughtful shade of purple. Perhaps there was more to this sleep phenomenon than she had initially calculated. Much more. The neural simulation should be ready for testing in approximately 3 days, Dr. Park said, reviewing the data on her tablet. The medical bay's soft lighting reflected off various pieces of modified equipment, a unique combination of human and Centaurian technology. After the reactor crisis, Nix had thrown herself into researching human sleep with renewed vigor. But this time, her approach was different. Instead of merely observing, she wanted to understand, to experience. And you're certain this will be safe? Marcus asked, examining the modified neural interface. His concern was evident in his voice, though he'd supported Nix's decision from the start. The interface has been calibrated to Centaurian neural patterns, Nix replied, her scales shifting through analytical patterns of blue and green. Dr. Park and I have run over 300 simulations. The risk is minimal. That's not quite what I asked, Marcus said softly. Nix's scales rippled with affectionate amusement. Your concern is noted, engineering specialist Reed. But as you humans say, some risks are worth taking. The days leading up to the experiment were filled with preparation and anticipation. Nix spent hours in the station's database, studying human dream journals and sleep research. What fascinated her most were the accounts of scientific breakthroughs that came through dreams, from Kekule's discovery of the benzene ring to Mendeleev's periodic table. I still don't understand how random neural firing patterns can lead to coherent solutions, she commented one evening, as she and Marcus shared a meal in the station's observation lounge. Maybe that's the point, Marcus suggested, watching the nearby nebula paint colors across her scales. Sometimes you need to let go of understanding and just experience. The night before the experiment, Nix found herself in Marcus's quarters again, this time not as an observer, but as a friend seeking reassurance. What if my mind is too ordered, too logical for dreams, she asked, her scales showing uncharacteristic uncertainty. Marcus smiled. Dreams aren't about logic, Nix. They're about possibility. About seeing connections you might miss when you're trying too hard to make sense of everything. Like the reactor solution. Exactly. Sometimes the best answers come when you stop looking for them. As she left his quarters, Nix paused at the door. Marcus, thank you. For helping me see that different isn't always inefficient. His smile stayed with her as she made her way back to her own quarters, her scales shifting through new patterns that reflected her evolving understanding of both humans and herself. The next morning, as the medical bay team made final preparations, Nix recorded what might be her last fully logical entry. Research log, Dr. Nix of the Centaurian Science Academy. Beginning experimental trial of human sleep state simulation. Previous assumptions about efficiency and consciousness may require significant revision. End log. Dr. Park began the final equipment check while Marcus stood by, ready to monitor the engineering aspects of the interface. The medical bay had been cleared of all non-essential personnel, though Nix noted several scientists watching eagerly through the observation window. Neural interface calibrated, Dr. Park announced. Centaurian biorhythm synchronization at optimal levels. Power system stable, Marcus added. Backup generators standing by. Nix settled onto the modified medical bed, her scales cycling through a complex pattern of anticipation and scientific curiosity. I still maintain that random neural firing patterns are a highly inefficient method of data processing, she said, but her tone held more humor than criticism now. We'll see about that, Marcus replied with a grin. Sweet dreams, Nix. As the interface activated and her consciousness began to shift in ways she'd never experienced, Nix's last clear thought was that perhaps efficiency wasn't everything. Sometimes, the most valuable discoveries came from letting go of what you thought you knew. The dream state awaited, and with it, a new understanding of both human nature and her own potential for growth. Her scales shifted to a color that had no name in any language as she prepared to experience something her species had never known, the power of unconscious thought. Neural interface stable, Dr. Park announced, checking the readings one final time. Are you sure about this, Nix? Nix's scales rippled with determination as she settled into the modified medical bay bed. After the reactor crisis, she had spent weeks developing a safe way to experience human-like sleep. Now, with Marcus and Dr. Park's help, she was ready to try it herself. My research will remain incomplete without direct experimentation, she replied, though her color patterns betrayed her nervousness. The interface will merely simulate the human sleep state while maintaining my core consciousness. Perfectly safe. Marcus took her hand, a gesture that sent a shimmer of iridescent patterns across her scales. Remember, dreams don't always make logical sense. That's kind of the point. I still maintain that random neural firing sequences are an inefficient data processing method, Nix said, but her tone held more curiosity than criticism now. Begin the sequence, Dr. Park. As the neural interface activated, Nix experienced something entirely foreign to her species, the gradual dimming of consciousness. Her typically ordered thoughts began to drift and merge, creating patterns she'd never imagined possible. She dreamed. In her dream, she floated through the station's corridors, but they twisted impossibly, forming Mobius strips of metal and light. Mathematical equations danced like stellar phenomena, and she understood them not through calculation, but through a kind of intuition she'd never known before. She saw the reactor's containment field as a living thing, pulsing in harmony with her own bioluminescence. And through it all, she felt something she'd never experienced in her continuous waking existence, the joy of discovery without analysis, understanding without computation. When she awoke 4 hours later, her mind felt simultaneously refreshed and expanded, as if she'd discovered a new way of processing reality. How do you feel? Marcus asked, still holding her hand. Different, Nix replied, her scales shifting through colors so quickly they created a rainbow effect. I believe I understand now. Sleep isn't just about physical recovery. It's about integration. Possibility. Seeing patterns that logic alone might miss. Dr. Park smiled, reviewing the neural readings. Your brain activity during the sleep state was fascinating. You actually created new neural pathways, ones that bridge your logical processing centers with areas analogous to human creative centers. I dreamed of equations dancing, Nix said softly. It should have been nonsensical, yet. I felt I understood the universe more deeply than ever before. The station's lights flickered briefly, an echo of the previous crisis, but this time, Nix saw the pattern differently. The power grid, she said suddenly. We've been approaching it too linearly. What if we treated it like those dancing equations? A fluid system rather than a rigid one? Marcus grinned. See? Sometimes you need to sleep on a problem. Over the next few days, Nix and Marcus implemented a revolutionary new power management system, one that combined Centaurian precision with human-inspired adaptability. The station's efficiency improved by 47%, and the design was soon being studied by engineers across the galaxy. But the real breakthrough came 3 months later, when Nix published her research paper, Comparative Consciousness, The Evolutionary Advantages of Alternative Cognitive States. It revolutionized both human and Centaurian understanding of consciousness, suggesting that different species' rest patterns weren't flaws, but rather specialized adaptations that offered unique advantages. You've changed, Marcus observed one day, as they watched the nearby nebula from the observation deck. Your scales show new color patterns I've never seen before. My species expresses emotional and intellectual growth through bioluminescent evolution, Nix explained. These new patterns, they represent the integration of logic and intuition. Something I never would have achieved without understanding the value of dreams. So humans aren't so inefficient after all, he teased. Nix's scales rippled with affectionate amusement. Perhaps efficiency isn't everything. Sometimes, one must power down to truly power up. She paused, her colors shifting to a more serious tone. The Centaurian Science Council has approved my request for a permanent position here on Helios. It seems they're interested in further research on human-Centaurian cooperation. And the fact that you've developed a fondness for a certain human engineer had nothing to do with that decision? Marcus asked, his eyes twinkling. That data point may have influenced my analysis, Nix admitted, her scales flushing with colors that needed no translation. As they turned back to watch the nebula, the station hummed around them with perfectly balanced power systems, a harmony of two different approaches to understanding the universe. And if anyone noticed that the station's most brilliant Centaurian scientist had developed a habit of taking short rest periods, alongside her human companion, well, that was just another fascinating data point in the ongoing study of interspecies relations.